On an ordinary Florida morning in 1982, a backhoe operator working at the edge of a pond in a new housing development scooped up something pale. At first glance, it looked like a stone, worn smooth by centuries of water and mud, but when he turned it in his hands, two eye sockets stared back at him. It was a human skull. His first thought, as he later admitted, was simply, oh shit. He had no idea that he had just uncovered one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in North America, a window into the lives of people who had walked the Florida landscape nearly 7,000 years earlier, long before the pyramids of Egypt, long before recorded history itself. The pond was small, barely a quarter of an acre, tucked into the Brevard County landscape near Titusville, not far from Cape Canaveral. At the time, developers Jack Eckert and Jim Swan were carving the land into the Windover Farms housing development. The pond was supposed to become just another feature of suburban life, a water view for modern homes. Instead, it turned into something much stranger, a cemetery preserved beneath the muck. When the skulls and bones were brought to local authorities, the initial reaction was confusion. The sheriff's office and medical examiner weren't sure whether they were dealing with a crime scene. A forensic expert even thought at first that he was handling modern Caucasian remains, but radiocarbon dating soon shattered that assumption. Two bones yielded ages of more than 7,200 years. The people of Windover had lived and died in Florida millennia before Europeans, before tribes known to later history, before most of the landscape even looked as it does now. Eckert and Swan could have bulldozed the site and moved on. Instead, to their credit, they halted construction and called in archaeologists. They even donated equipment worth $60,000 to help pump water from the pond so that excavation could proceed. The state of Florida added funding, and a young archaeologist named Glenn Doran from Florida State University took charge. Alongside his colleague David Dickel, he set out to do what few thought possible: excavate a peat pond without destroying the fragile remains it held. Digging in peat was not like digging in soil. It was like trying to carve through chocolate mousse underwater. The muck had to be sliced carefully with sharpened trowels, sometimes even wooden chopsticks, to expose the bones without letting them crumble. Spray bottles of water were kept on hand to keep everything moist. If a bone dried too quickly, it could split apart in seconds. Over 3 field seasons in the mid-1980s, Doran and Dickel's team uncovered 168 individuals. The skeletons belonged to men and women, the young and the old, from infants to elders in their 60s. About half were children. Their average height, their bones wear and tear, the healed fractures, the signs of malnutrition and disease, all told stories of a life that was harsh but also communal. Arthritis marked the joints of adults. Many children showed interrupted growth, signs of periodic famine or illness. Yet there were also signs of remarkable care. One boy of about 15 had been born with spina bifida. His bones were fragile, one of his feet had been amputated, and he would have been paralyzed below the waist. And yet he had lived to his teenage years, which in a nomadic hunter-gatherer society meant that his people had carried him, fed him, cared for him. His survival spoke volumes about the compassion and cohesion of his community. The burials themselves were meticulous. Most were placed on their left sides, flexed with heads to the west. They were wrapped in hand-woven fabrics and anchored with wooden stakes driven through the wrappings into the peat, as if to keep them from floating away. Clusters of burials suggest episodes of use spanning 1,000 years, generations returning to the same sacred pond to lay their dead to rest. Children and teenagers were buried with more goods than adults. Necklaces made of fish vertebrae or shells, bags, mats, tools, as though the community marked their potential as especially precious. What stunned scientists most was not just the preservation of bones, but of brains. When Doran first noticed the greasy brownish lumps inside some skulls, he joked it might be snail droppings, but tests confirmed it was shrunken but intact human brain tissue. 91 skulls held remnants of brains preserved by the peat's acidic, oxygen-free environment. Some still displayed recognizable structures under MRI and microscopes. For the first time, advances in technology meant researchers could sequence DNA from remains that ancient. The results were startling. The Windover people carried genetic markers linking them to ancient populations from Asia, consistent with migration across Beringia thousands of years earlier. But their DNA did not match any living Native American groups. Either their lineage had died out, or it had been swallowed by the bottlenecks and shifts of human history. One family's remains even showed continuity of use at the pond for over a century, hinting at generational memory of this watery cemetery. Inside some skeletons, archaeologists found the last meals, seeds of wild grapes, elderberries, prickly pear, teeth worn to nubs by grit from stone-ground food. Cavities were rare, but wear was brutal, often exposing pulp before adulthood. Plant remains around the gut suggested medicinal use, perhaps the earliest evidence of humans in North America deliberately consuming pain-relieving plants. Artifacts buried with the bodies painted a picture of a society both resourceful and artistic. More than 80 textile fragments survived, representing at least 7 weaving techniques. Ponchos, mats, blankets, clothing, the oldest preserved fabrics in the New World. Tools made from deer antler, shark teeth, and bone testified to hunting, fishing, and crafting. Bottle gourds, the earliest evidence of vegetable storage containers in North America, lay beside the dead. Some were decorated, others practical. A woman in her 20s was buried with 3 necklaces, one made of fish vertebrae, another of palm seeds, another of shells. Even in death, beauty mattered. The excavation revealed violence too. One man had an antler point embedded in his pelvis, a wound that likely killed him. Another skull showed fractures from blunt trauma, but most lives ended from disease, accident, or hardship. Half of the population died before adulthood, a sobering reminder of how precarious life was in prehistoric Florida. Yet despite the hardship, they crafted, they cared, they remembered. The discovery's legacy was immense. Wendover quickly became one of the most important archaeological sites in the Americas, dubbed by some the American Pompeii of the Archaic. Newspapers blared headlines when brain tissue was confirmed. Local artists held contests inspired by the site. Scientists flew in from around the world. For Doran, it was overwhelming. He had to hire a full-time communications officer just to handle the flood of media and academic interest. By the end of the 3rd season, only half the pond had been excavated. The rest deliberately left untouched for future generations with better technology. The significance of Wendover went beyond Florida. It joined a handful of other mortuary ponds in the state: Little Salt Spring, Bay West, Republic Groves, in proving that ancient people used watery graves. Stakes through wrappings may have symbolized anchoring souls, echoing native traditions that water blocked spirits from returning. At nearby sites like Warm Mineral Springs, burials went back as far as 12,000 years. And in 2016, offshore near Venice, Florida, divers found another peat pond cemetery now submerged beneath the Gulf of Mexico, confirming the practice was widespread. But Wendover stood out for its scale, preservation, and timing. Laws passed in the late 1980s and 1990s to protect indigenous remains would have prevented such a complete excavation today. What Wendover leaves us is not just a collection of bones and artifacts, but a hauntingly intimate portrait of people who lived and died thousands of years ago. People whose DNA left no direct descendants, but whose care for one another, whose creativity, whose rituals of burial resonate across time. They were not nameless primitives, but parents, children, friends, hunters, weavers, mourners. They carried their paralyzed boy until his teens. They buried their daughters with necklaces. They crafted gourds into containers. They laid their dead in a pond and trusted the water to hold them. In their bones, their brains, their seeds, their cloth, their love and struggle survives.